But when you're talking about structural problems, Joe Zarelli, what do you mean? You don't mean the same thing as Lisa Brown does, do you?
First of all, let me go back and say my attempt was not to scapegoat on we were talking about the education area, you talked about big elephants. We'd all be foolish to say that they don't have significant influence down there. That's not to bash or demean those who are in the profession at all. It's just a fact of life. And as Lisa indicated, all those other entities have a level of influence too, but some are bigger than others. That is a fact. As far as this issue of whether the tax system works or not, we can hope and pray for a lot of things when it comes to the tools that we have in government to do the job that we're tasked with. But my point is this. Whatever the tax system is and whatever the revenue is projected to come in, we have to do the best we can with that. We all, as we grow, hope to do better as we grow in age and can move into a bigger house or do whatever it is on our list of things, our bucket list to do. But until we can afford it, we can't really do them. And I think what Senator Brown's talking about may or may not be true. I believe clearly we have to do something about the B&O tax. It's very difficult to start and grow a small business when you're paying taxes when you're losing money. That's just unconscionable, and we've got to fix some of these things. But until that happens, we have what we have. And the reform I'm talking about is the better use of those dollars so that we can do more with what we do have, not what we hope to have. And then if you get to a point where you change the tax structure and it changes how money comes in, I'm a firm believer we're not going to see more. We're going to just see it come in different ways. But still, you're going to have to be in a position to use that in the best way possible. I think that's our first responsibility as stewards to the public is how we spend what comes in and to buy the things that are supposedly supposed to support everybody the opportunity to achieve their dream.
You criticize the business and occupation tax. I've heard you criticize the business and occupation tax also, Lisa Brown. It's the tax on businesses, and you get taxed whether you make money or not. I have rarely heard a businessman call my show and say, B&O tax is okay. They all trash it. You were like Senate leaders, and we still have the B&O tax, and as far as I know, there's not much of a move to change it. Why is that the case, Joe Zarelli?
Well, from my perspective, if you're going to negotiate a change in how we tax, it has to be done constitutionally, because there's a lack of trust. Senator Brown alluded to, and we're going to get to the whole two-thirds vote, the initiative. 3 years in a row, the public have said that's what they want. That's a message to me that they don't trust Olympia on issues of taxation, and that's a statewide message. So for me, if we're going to change significantly the structure of taxes, we have to do it in such a way that the people know that what they're voting for will be permanent, and it won't be something that we're going to do now and then come back and give them what we just told them they're not going to have. It's kind of like the sales tax. If we didn't have a piece of that constitutionally protected for roads in this state, I guarantee you we would have taken that money and put it into other things on the operating budget side, and we'd had less dollars for transportation projects. And we already have too little in that area. So we need to do it in such a way that people can trust that the change is permanent or protected enough or difficult enough to change again, that we're not going to just get that and then we're going to give them what we took away before. I think that's the key.
What's the third or fourth time we're going to be voting on this measure that requires a supermajority to raise taxes or to get rid of tax exemptions in the state? Lisa Brown, it seems like voters want this in place, but it never stays in place, and Tim Eyman brings it back, and it ends up passing by fairly large majorities. Is this telling the legislature that it's not doing its job?
Well, we've mostly lived under that because it has been passed by voters. But I think two things about it. One, we deserve to know whether or not it's constitutional. I think the framers of our Constitution laid out some very specific cases when they said a supermajority was important, and one of those was actually changing the Constitution itself. But they certainly didn't say that that was the case for the budget. And here's how I look at it. If essentially you require a supermajority to write the budget, what that means is you're saying a minority is writing the budget. And if a minority is writing a budget, the minority is also dictating policy. Because what sense does it make for us to pass great policy, which honestly I believe we've tried to do in education and other areas, and then not be able to back that up with a majority rule? So I think we deserve to know the constitutionality. And I also think that the ultimate check on legislators who would vote for a tax, which is not obviously something that people would do easily or lightly, but if they do it, they go back to their voters, and certainly there will be campaign brochures letting people know what they did, and they will be held accountable for that. And I want to point out that the first time the two-thirds initiative came up in my district, it failed. And I have a district, it's the second lowest income district in the state, where there is a lot of appreciation for programs for special needs kids and the whole social safety net, because a lot of people moved to Spokane from rural areas to take advantages of those things. And they voted against the two-thirds initiative, which made me feel that I really had the backing of my district to take it on and to try to get the Supreme Court to rule on it.
And we'll have a ruling from the Supreme Court in the not-too-distant future on the constitutionality of this, right?
I hope so.
And then, as far as you're concerned, if they uphold it?
If they uphold it, we live under it. That's the way our system works. Absolutely. But I'm also open to, I understand Senator Zarelli's argument about the public being skeptical of just wholesale changes in the tax structure. That's a very challenging thing to bring about. And yet, aren't we called upon to do those challenging things? I mean, that's why when I became the budget chair, I worked to put the Gates Tax Structure Commission in place, because I felt like we needed something outside the legislative process to give us some options. One of the options they gave us for improving our budgeting system was the Rainy Day Fund, which Senator Zarelli championed, and we worked on together to actually change our Constitution, so we now have a Rainy Day Fund.
Senator Zarelli, when it comes to this next budget, which you won't have to work through, are we past those years of billion-dollar cuts that the legislature has had to face? Are we out of the woods?
No, in fact, I think the current projection is for about $1 billion, but that's a slight maneuvering, I think, given the experience that most have had. I think the more challenging thing is going to be bringing the skill sets together to kind of go through the decision points that really a lot of the folks that had in the past may or may not be in those roles anymore. So there'll be a steep learning curve, I think, for a handful of folks, but they'll get it done. And I think a lot of that depends on what happens at the federal level. I think that we're not out of the woods as a country, and a lot of countries outside of the U.S. aren't either, as far as what we're doing about our debt, how we're correcting course economically, and what the future holds. And we're dependent upon all that, especially in Washington State, where we are heavily dependent upon international trade, one of the highest trade-dependent states in the nation. And if the economy of Asia and these other developing these countries in Asia that are growing quickly, and Europe, if they go into a bit of a tailspin, that'll have a huge impact on the economy of Washington State more quickly than it will in other parts of the country. So I think there's still a reason to heed and to be cautious and careful, and not look at simply thinking that we can add significant cost or burden or expectation to the current structure of how we've been doing the budgets to get by the last few years.
One of the criticisms I have frequently about our taxation system is that it's the people who are at the low end of the economic standard pay a higher percentage of their taxes than people at the high end. It's called a regressive tax system. In fact, by some measures, it's one of the most regressive tax systems in the country. I wonder if you agree with that, and if you do, if you see that as a problem.
Well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, if you're in lower income, that means you have less money that's being spent on non-necessary expenditures. I mean, housing, food, healthcare, all these different things that are base needs that somebody with a lower income is going to be more likely to spend the majority of their income on aren't taxable items anyway. It's discretionary income where we make the sales tax, and that tends to grow the amount of discretionary income, and then the tax that comes off of that spending comes as you move up the middle income to higher wealth households. That's where a lot of that growth comes from. I will say this, though. We've spent the last several years, the poorer households that are more likely to pay a lot of sales tax comes from the areas that we've increased significantly in the last many years, and that's what we call sin taxes. Alcohol, tobacco, in these different areas, which, statistically are going to be more dominant in those households. So as we've raised, let's say, the cost of a pack of cigarettes from a few bucks to $7, that's $4 per day or whatever that's coming out of that household that has minimal income. Not that I'm saying that that's good for them to be doing. I'm just saying that's the nature of the beast that we're in as far as where a lot of that purchasing comes from, what that discretionary income is paid.
Are you suggesting that the reason we're seeing people in lower income brackets paying more in sales taxes is because they're buying more alcohol and
No,
smoking?
that's not what I'm saying.
Okay,
I'm trying to draw a clarity around statistically where you're going to find more tobacco users is going to be in lower income pieces of the economy today. And so as that price has been raised, there is a lot of money in taxes that are collected in those lower incomes. That's the point I'm trying to raise.
Lisa Brown, what's your take on this issue of what's called regressivity in our tax structure?
Well, I think it's clearly one of the most regressive in the country. I think it's also not ultimately competitive for business over the long run. Now, having said that, most of our states' major businesses have figured out ways to get accommodations that work for them. However, as we go forward, if we really want to take on the business and occupations tax, the biggest burden of which is paid by small or medium-sized businesses or businesses that never have much lobbying power in Olympia, then we'll have to think about how to replace that business and occupations tax with a net tax of some sort. And it makes the most sense, if you look at our neighboring states, to replace it with some kind of personal income tax and corporate net tax. And I don't think that's a radical idea. It's not radical in Idaho, which is a few miles away from me. It's not radical in Oregon. You could go to some states where you didn't have it. I think there are 6. But I don't think most people in Washington want to do that. And I think they would agree that the most affluent citizens in our state, we have millionaires and billionaires who are paying taxes, but they're paying them to Uncle Sam at the federal level. It seems to me, would, for the most part, many of them would be happy to pay them at the state level and know that it was going to support Washington public schools and Washington universities and colleges.
Some of them were. Bill Gates Sr. was, and many other outspoken ones, but voters said no.
Yes, they did. And you know, I believe that in a tough economic time, people are going to be very cautious about their pocketbooks, and I don't blame them one bit for that. I think, like I said, it's not enough to be right. I think the facts are on my side on this issue, but I think values are too in terms of a more equal tax structure. But you have to engage in a public process that often takes years. I voted for things in my freshman year in Olympia in 1993 that did not pass in the Senate for 10 to 15 years later, like simple majority for school levies, like anti-discrimination based on sexual orientation. So I'm very used to the concept that it takes a long time to make progressive public policy.
You know, we read constantly that nothing can get done in the other Washington because of the toxic political environment. The turf wars going on between Republicans and Democrats are just impossible to solve. And when it comes to the state level, Joe Zarelli, does any of that permeate here? I mean, you worked across the aisle with Ed Murray, your Senate counterpart, to come up with a budget together at one point along the line. So it seems, at least in that instance, there was a pretty good working relationship. Is there that toxicity we see at the national level, at the state level?
Yeah, not at one time. We did this last year. Despite how we got to a budget this last year, I'll remind that everybody, I think historically, we've never seen the level of support from both sides of the aisle in passing a final budget than we saw this last year. What do we have? 44 votes, and there were, I think, 46 people on the floor. 3 people had left, weren't there for the rest of the special session that would have supported that budget. So despite how it started, we kind of got the party started in a way that maybe some didn't like, but at the end of the day, we got something done that I think in a lot of ways hasn't been done in the state of Washington. So I felt good about that ultimately. So we did work together, and we worked together on a lot of these reform issues together. Lisa and I, Ed, others. We've got, I believe, a lot of positive things accomplished over the last few years, but that's because I think, again, the situation dictated that we try to do something different. I'm not going to sit here and say that had times been very different, that Senator Brown and her majority would have been as willing with us, nor maybe we would not have been as willing with them, but I think we stood up. We decided that despite our differences, let's find a way to solve these problems together. And to get there, what's it going to take for us to kind of come? What's it going to take for you to come? And we accomplished that through realizing priorities for Democrats in the budget while realizing what priorities were for Republicans, and neither having to give up so much that it wasn't doable, but instead focusing on the things that we were able to accomplish that were of benefit to, you know, kind of the belief system that both sides bring to governing or to governance. And that's how we got there.
Senator Brown alluded to the election year influencing the budget deliberations this time around. Do you agree with that? Did you see the influence of the election year?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Did you think that the fact that this is an election year affected the way that you were able to work together in Olympia in this session?
Absolutely not. I'm not running.
Not for you, then. How about the senators around you?
What we did this last year, like I said, in I believe very clearly, in fact, I know, you know, without asking specifically, that we're both on the same course this year. Listen, when we went into the session, there was a very different situation. There was some newfound money, and there was a belief, I believe on the Democrat side, that if we just did A, B, and C, boom, we can get a budget out of here. We don't have to do any of this reform stuff. We don't have to listen to the other side of the aisle on this one. And to be honest with you, a lot of the majority on Lisa's side of the aisle is very liberal. A lot of it on our side is very conservative. And if a budget initiated, from our perspective, from their side of the aisle, it wouldn't be something that we or any of us could support. And I believe that had we had to do that all on our own, then it would be a similar type of situation. So the goal became, how can we do something that we can get enough people to support 25 votes to kind of get this thing engineered or going, with the expectation, the clear understanding that the end result was not going to be what those 25 votes started with. And I lost people along the way, but at the end of the day, we gained almost everybody through that process.
Could you expand on what you said earlier about the election year influencing the budget?
Well, my belief about the budget that we ended up with is that it wasn't that much different than the budget the Senate Democrats started out with. And obviously, there were some changes that were made in negotiating with the Senate Republicans and also the House. But in the end, we started with a budget, and we made a rather dramatic decision this year, which is it was time to stop cutting education and higher education. And we've figured out a way to do that and still maintain commitments to the social safety net. I'm not going to say there weren't, you know, hard choices there. There were, but we did it. I think it's clear that what got in the way was a couple things. I think Joe didn't say this, but his leadership said it, that going for marriage equality early in the session was going to keep us from getting a budget agreement. And I think it made it harder for us to work together, because that created a lot of tension, particularly in the Senate Republican caucus. The other issue was the issue of reforms. And again, I don't see anybody being against reform if reform means getting better outcomes at a lower cost. Yeah, we're all for that. The versions of those bills that were initially introduced, I made clear, especially to my more conservative members who were interested in those bills, that we could work toward a version of those bills that would accommodate reform, but that the initial versions of them were too extreme. And I still believe that, and I'm glad. And if we had to stay an extra 30 days to get more moderate versions of them, I think it was worth that.
Do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, as I said before, the budget is not a standalone thing. It's what it's buying. And as Senator Brown just alluded to, had we not been able to start from a negotiating perspective of where we started, we're able to get 25 votes for, the reform, the changes that will greatly benefit the taxpayers of this state in the future would never have happened. If they'd have had their way and been able to get their 25 votes to get a budget out, it would have been picked up in the House, sent to the governor, signed, and we'd have left town. So at the end of the day, we ended up close to maybe where we had gotten there with some very key differences. We were able in the last 2 years to eliminate about $12 billion worth of unfunded liabilities just in our state pension systems. Had we not worked together and stood on some of these things, we'd have never got those changes in the system. Even though they're marginal changes in some senses, the things we did this last year does not affect any current state employee. It affects all future employees, but it shaves billions of dollars off of that unfunded liability that somebody's going to have to pay in the very near future. We got changes around budgeting requirements that were important to us, and that is we're now required to look at not just making a new spending decision today, what that equates to for the next year or 18 months, but how that affects your spending over the next 4 years, so that we're actually planning how we're spending money and not just buying things and setting ourselves up for the type of cutting we've had to do the last few years, promising to do things and then finding out that we can't afford to do them all. And then we got to go say, well, we need to raise taxes if we're going to continue to do these, or finding something else to cut. And that always goes back to higher ed, as we've seen. When we get pushed, higher education takes the brunt of the stick. And that's not a way to govern. We need to be able to make commitments to people, whatever it is we're going to pay from a policy perspective, that we're going to be there in partnership for those that we say we're going to pay, not add and delete every 6 months or every 12 months.
Of course, it's not just higher ed. There were voter-approved initiatives to improve the situation financially for K-12, but they didn't come with the funding. Now a court has found that the state is not meeting its paramount duty to provide basic education K-12. You two have been legislative leaders. Is this not in some way an indictment about what you've been doing in your jobs for your terms, Joe Zarelli?
No, actually, several years ago. I think the key first is about how we fix the levy system. You have some districts around the state that can raise all the money they want. You have others that are property poor that can't raise any money. So you end up with this inconsistency in how you fund education in the state. And even though it's a constitutional responsibility first to the state, depending on where your address is, will determine what kind of education, in many cases, your kids has. That needs to be fixed. And I've presented a solution and open for comment several years ago about that. But ultimately, what the court presents the legislature with, I think, is first and foremost not a matter of, again, how much money we spend on education, but what we're paying for in education. In other words, there are things within the system that we pay for that are really up to the legislature to decide how much you want to pay for that. But what we don't have a right to make a decision about is not doing certain things. And so, again, to me, it's not about just saying, okay, well, let's put another $3 billion into it and hope it fixes itself. We have an obligation with that to take a look at what we've been doing, what we're getting out of how we're spending the money. And the first correction I would hope people would expect out of us is to get an accounting for how we're spending money currently, what's working within that spending scheme, if you will, and then invest new dollars into where we think we're going to get the best outcomes with that additional money.
We've been spending a lot of money. Why don't we know that now?
Well, we do. We do, but see, here's the thing is a lot of people don't understand that the legislature does not control how dollars get spent in schools. We earmark it out in blocks. Then districts locally negotiate with their staff, tell them what they're going to pay them, what their benefits are, regardless of the pay schedule that the legislature funds. They can choose to give more, less. Well, they can't do less than the pay schedule, but they do more. And so they add on to it from local levies, okay? And then we send dollars in other categorical funding, and then the district makes decisions, again, through collective bargaining about how that money is going to get spent with all parties involved. So we don't get to influence that. We need more control over that if we're going to get better outcomes. We need to start driving from a policy perspective, to a certain extent, what you can and can't do with that money. And
we meaning the legislature.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Otherwise, we can't be held accountable ultimately if we don't take back some of the control, at least, not how they do education, but how they spend money that the state is sending them.